Hello, my name is Andrew Ahn Westover, and I'm the Keith Haring Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to today's conversation between Rashid Johnson and Massimiliano Gioni. This program series includes over a dozen artist conversations presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. I would particularly like to thank Education and Public Engagement staff members Andrea Calories and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. New Museum digital initiatives are generously supported by Hermione and David B. Heller. We also thank our members and supporters, like you, who help make these programs possible. I'll now share brief biographical notes about this program's featured artist. Rashid Johnson is a contemporary American artist whose multidisciplinary practice incorporates sculpture, painting, drawing, filmmaking, and installation. His work deftly engages cultural identities, literature, and critical history to consider both the potential and boundaries that personal narratives offer for material representation and collective understandings. Recent solo exhibitions include Rashid Johnson, Anxious Audience, The Power Plant in Toronto, Rashid Johnson, Los Senderistas, Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, Rashid Johnson, The Hikers at the Aspen Museum, Provocations by Rashid Johnson, the Institute of Contemporary Art at Virginia Commonwealth University, Rashid Johnson, No More Water at Lismore Castle Arts in Lismore, Ireland, Rashid Johnson, Hail We Now Sing Joy at the Milwaukee Art Museum, which traveled also to the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City, and Rashid Johnson, Within Our Gates at the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow. Johnson's artwork is in the permanent collections of many public institutions, including the Art Institute of Chicago, Astrup Fearnley Museum of Modern Art in Oslo, Brooklyn Art Museum in Brooklyn, Guggenheim Museum in New York, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the Perez Art Museum in Miami, Studio Museum in Harlem, Walker Art Center, Minneapolis, and the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. And now, a few logistical notes before we begin. This program will last for approximately 1 hour. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time by clicking the Q&A button, located at the bottom of your screen, to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. If there is time, our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, I encourage you to learn more about upcoming public programs and our full suite of exclusive digital content on our website, newmuseum.org. And now, without further ado, I turn the conversation over to the New Museum's Edlis Neeson Artistic Director, Massimiliano Gioni.
Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And a special thanks to Rashid Johnson, who is joining us for this conversation. I don't want to introduce Rashid because Andrew has just done it so perfectly, but I do want to thank Rashid publicly because he's been really a friend of the museum in this adventure of the exhibition Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, and not only contributes a wonderful piece to the show, but he is being really a great participant in this adventure, and it's been really a pleasure to be in dialogue with him in the past few months, or almost probably more than a year at this point. And Rashid, so welcome, and let's begin our conversation. As I've been asking all the artists who have been guests in this series of conversations, I want to start by talking about Okwi Enwezor, who, as you know, and as everybody at this point I hope knows, conceived and organized the exhibition for us, and sadly passed away in 2019. So Rashid, do you want to tell us about how and when you met Okwi?
Hey, Massimiliano, how are you? Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here with you guys. While listening to Andrew introduce me, I kept thinking to myself, I've really got to shorten my my CV for these kinds of introductions. But it's humbling. I met Massimiliano, I'm sorry, I met Okwi probably close to 20 years ago. He had curated an exhibition called Short Century that happened to take place at the MCA Chicago, I think as one of its first venues. And I was a student at the time and went to go see that show endless amounts of times. And I was really blown away by just the quality of that work. And my mother's a historian who had an emphasis on post-colonial feminist theory. And that kind of post-colonial space in contemporary art was something that I should have been more aware of. But the fact that Okwi was able to kind of guide me through it, and really it functioned as an introduction to a lot of us to that space. And I happened to have the opportunity to meet Okwi over the course of that exhibition being up and talk to him. He and I didn't become close friends at that time, but he was someone who I really looked up to and have continued to look up to and think about quite a bit.
And were you already making art at that point? I probably yes, no. And did the show itself have an impact on your thinking and actual making of art at that point?
Very much so. I was making art. I was kind of deep into my thinking around what was possible for me as an artist, and that show did kind of help me with some framework. One of the things that was for me kind of essential to how that exhibition functioned is a lot of my interest lies in that post-colonial space, and for him to use that as kind of a grid in which to start to unpack the history of art, and to thinking about where and how canonical structures begin and have the opportunity to intervene in how we process was essential to my thinking at the time, and really helped graduate some ideas that I had and was working towards forward.
Mm-hmm. You also told me, and now we are jumping to the recent past, that Okwi mentioned the exhibition to you, the Grief and Grievance show, or anyway hinted at it. I don't know if you want to talk about, or if you remember how that exchange occurred, or.
Yeah, I remember it quite well. It was a few years back, I think maybe 4 years ago. And I had an exhibition that had closed not long before at Hauser and Wirth Gallery. Okwi was being honored at Performa, and we were at the gala to pay homage to him. And it was quite interesting because he had just come down from accepting his honor. And he kind of beelined to me, and he'd seen me in the crowd. He said, "Look, I have something I really want to talk to you about." And he was at the time kind of fending off people who were excited to congratulate him. And he said, he didn't explain much about what the exhibition was or what his plans were. He just said that he'd seen my show, and there was something really important that he wanted to talk to me about. And at that time, I was quite excited because Okwi and I hadn't had the opportunity to work together. And many of my friends had worked with him, and other artists who I looked up to had worked with him. And it was really kind of on my bucket list to be considered for an exhibition that he was planning. And so I was incredibly enthusiastic to hear about his excitement for some of the things I was making. He didn't say what body of work, he didn't say what the theme of the exhibition was, but I'm assuming now that this is likely the exhibition that he was thinking about at the time.
And before we discuss the show and specifically also your work in the show, I do want to step back actually to the short century, and I want to ask you about how in your work, particularly, I don't know if you're too young to start talking about your early work, but the certain notions of Afrocentrism and certain ideas about cultural belonging have been very central in your work in ways that they were also somewhat critical or nostalgic, or anyway, with a sense of both longing and detachment, particularly in your dioramas. So I want to ask you if that image of African culture that Okwi stage in the short century contributed in any way for you to understand your own reading of certain ideas around Afrocentrism that were crucial in your work and maybe also in your upbringing.
I think that there are definitely kind of points in that exhibition that help graduate other ideas forward for me. I come from both an inside and outside perspective, being that my stepfather is Nigerian, like Okwi, so I have some of this sensibility and was raised in a household with quite a few Nigerian family members coming in and out, etc. That gave me some perspective on what kind of an African identity would look like. And it's something that I've always kind of tried to navigate with both of my parents, my father and mother, not being from the continent, but me traveling there early on in life. And really, if I'm to be completely honest, on my first trip to West Africa, and I spent time in Dakar on that trip, I came to realize the significant difference between my experience as an American and then my longing to identify with a certain kind of Africanness. And from that space, I started to employ humor, signifiers, and tools that help me deconstruct that engagement, whether it's shea butter, which still is quite present in my work, or black soap, or some of the other signifiers and themes, whether it be kind of in the literary tradition or through their material presence, are all kind of active components. When I think about Okwi's show in particular, the thing that I take away most from the short century was what was happening with picture making. And early on in my project, I had an incredible investment in photography and what photography represented as an opportunity to document, explore time, and place us and really kind of locate us in nounness, or in kind of the specificity of a time. And short century so specifically kind of mandates that we look at a specific period of time. And the title is so incredibly dynamic. This idea that it's a century nonetheless, right? It's a century, like a sense that it marks this time that belongs to an Africa that has found its independence, and what and how we frame that, how that then connects to identities like mine, which are invested in exploring the dynamic between the African sensibility and the American sensibility. And to go back to that first trip to Africa, I was never more American than when I got off the plane in Dakar, Senegal. I was never more American, and that was an eye-opening experience, even for a boy who had so much familiarity with an African sensibility via family.
And I remember when we actually started talking about Okwi's show and after his passing, and I shared with you his narrative. I remember, I don't remember your exact words, but I remember that you were not hesitant, because you obviously understood and knew the importance of the project and also the importance of what Okwi called a national emergency of Black grief. But I also remember we talked about how in your work you had also tried to move away from certain ideas around Blackness in America. And I remember you telling me about how for a long time you've been in a sense more interested in Black middle class life and sort of presenting that sphere of life to the viewer, and how this exhibition, I don't know if you were concerned, maybe you can tell me, but you felt some hesitations about the exhibition maybe presenting certain atmospheres that you felt had maybe exited your work, or that you were careful about? I don't know if I'm summarizing your thinking properly or not, but
Yeah, I think you're touching on some things that were absolutely of concern to me. And I would go kind of a step further and just suggesting that in my project, I am very much aware of grief and pain and the tragedy that often accompanies the Black experience. What I had kind of moved to exploring, and I think it's always really been present in a conscious space in my work, is uh, the fact that Blackness is not a monolithic space, and that tragedy is not kind of exclusively the experience of Black folks in this country. I'm disappointed sometimes when we're not able to explore the joys of our experience, or kind of the mundane, which is something that I'm even more interested in right now. And I guess my concern and my question was, how are we going to illustrate this concept of grief? And to my kind of pleasant surprise, in how Oakley approached this process and the artists that he chose to participate, one of the things that I found to be incredibly rewarding about seeing how this process has worked and whom he's brought in is that it's really filled with artists whose work explores themes that go grandly beyond the one kind of conclusive position of grief. Mm-hmm. And he's more or less asked us to interpret and negotiate the projects of these artists through lenses that maybe sometimes fit and have a real direct relationship to it. And other times you have to kind of unpack why and who and how the works that you're seeing, whether it's my work, whether it's the work of Mark Bradford or Julie Marietu, who are my partners on that floor, or Jack Whitten, like how and in which ways we illustrate the themes of the exhibition. There was an easier route for him, one that would have been considerably more didactic, one that would have been considerably more legible and easily interpreted, where he would have included artists and artworks that really kind of conjure the concept quite easily. And his decision to more or less put this idea in the hands of artists whose work navigate more than singular principles and aren't beholden to a monolithic approach to art making, our thematic approach to art making that kind of consumes or cannibalizes Blackness into a space of tragedy exclusively, is really kind of the brilliance of it. And I think that that's almost best illustrated in some respect by Arthur Jafa's film, which really masterfully and in an incredibly macro sense explores Black joy and magic and tragedy all at once. So if you were to look at it, you can get any of those ideas from that work. And I think that can be said of a lot of the different works in the show, mine included.
Yeah, actually, when we spoke about the show with Oakley, and his choice of your piece was very deliberate. He wanted Antoine's organ, and he wanted it on the fourth floor, which is also, on many levels, it's the only place where he could have fit it, but he takes on both a kind of spectacular and also very almost religious presence, but when he was speaking about that, your piece and other works in the show, I was particularly taken by the fact that in a show about mourning and a show about grief, he was actually including your work, which on many levels is not about that. And with the presence of the plants and the music or the live music is on many levels actually a piece about life and a piece about a sense of vitality that contrasts completely the sort of immediate reading that one could have applied to to that subject. So maybe actually we can look at a couple of images so that whoever hasn't been able to see the show can get a sense of the sculpture, which is this massive installation that comprises, I believe, more than 50 live plants. And I should have done my statistics a little better, but maybe, Rashid, do you remember how large or tall and how many intricacy composite sorry, my son is entering the room. I can't. Gigi, devi andare via un attimo.
I'm so happy to see that. I thought it was going to be me first.
So I don't know, Rashid, if you have some basic facts about the sculpture that we can share, and just to give a sense, and maybe also in the next image, people can get a better sense of the scale.
Yeah, I can more or less make it up and get fairly close. I think that the sculpture is about 16 feet high, and I want to guess that it's somewhere between 30 and 40 feet long and about 12 feet wide. So it's a fairly significant work and scale, and it has, you know, I think you suggested 50 plus plants. I think it's even more. Honestly, it's really got a greenhouse-like feel. It's a really occupied. It's really full and dense. And of course, at its core, in the center of this work, is a piano, which we invite different musicians to come play when it's been installed in different venues. It carries the name, Antoine's organ, of the first pianist to whom I asked to play inside of the work, who continues to play inside that work, Antoine Baldwin. And he comes to the new museum, I know, on Saturdays to play. And as I was conceiving this work, I come across and met Antoine, and the experience of seeing this young guy and his relationship to his instrument really changed how I was thinking about a sculpture that I was working on, and the sculpture took on his name after I met him. So in some ways, he helped inspire the direction of this piece.
And the piece is, you know, because I've been spending a lot of time with it, it keeps literally growing on me. One thing you told me early on was how people who love plants immediately connect to this piece. And I'm one of those people that is capable of killing a cactus. You know, I'm not I'm not very good with plants, but there is this sort of immediacy of identification with the plants, and the more I've seen that also from people who are not necessarily plant lovers, the piece immediately makes you think of definitions of lives, in a sense. You know, that's what I've been maybe projecting on Oqui's interpretation of this work, but this idea that the work forces you to think about what defines life, what is the border between the animate and the inanimate, what is the border between the living and the non-living, the sentient and the non-sentient. It's all evoked in the sculpture. And knowing also Oqui's interest in the writing of Judy Butler about what she or they call precarious life, and what defines a life, I thought that it was really somewhat of a genial inclusion, because he speaks so much about debates on care, about what is the right to be mourned, and which lives matter, in a sense, but by doing almost abstractly. And I want to ask you, were any of these thoughts in your mind when you made the piece, or do you want to talk a little more about the inception of the piece, when it started? Or
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, quite a few of the aspects of concern were present in the work as it was originally conceived. You spoke about people's love of plants and their relationship to them, and their enthusiasm for seeing them treated well and taken care of. And I'm sure you've experienced this at the New Museum, and it's an anecdote that I've shared in the past as far as it comes to this work, is that people are they're really, really present for and concerned for for how a work like this is maintained. And I often joke that someone will step over a homeless person, run into the building, and start quizzing everyone on who's going to water the plants and how those plants are going to be taken care of. And this work is built with the intention of taking care and of thinking about care and what our relationship to care is. But the thing that's quite interesting, when that person comes in and expresses their concern for this work and for the things that live inside of this work, it brings this sense of empathy into the room that is honestly something that I never expected the work to do. I didn't, and I could say this honestly, I didn't come to art necessarily with this idea of poetry and more of these kind of gentle philosophical concerns being present in it. And it's something that's been born of the work quite naturally. I think it's been informed in some ways by my relationship to my son and by fatherhood, by building a different sense of empathy, by investing in growth and life and expectations, thinking about teaching, thinking about my own history, and really exploring that history, not with the intention of kind of the didactic opportunity for observation and exploration, are being generous for the purpose of just of telling someone something, but because it's given me this chance to really explore the kind of inner dialogue that comes as a result of just being and more than anything else. The genesis of this work really, when I think back, is an experience, a set of experiences that I had as a younger man in Chicago, starting at the MCA Chicago, which was coming to the museum, becoming aware of the work of Carl Andre, looking at his panels on the floor, coming to realize with a group of friends who happen to be Black men as well, that we had access to those panels and that we could stand on them. And then coming back over and over again, realizing that we had agency in that space with that work, and then starting to breakdance on them, starting to kind of bring them to life. And seeing my body and the bodies of my friends occupying the space provided by that stage that Andre produced, right, within the context of a deconstructed object or of an industrial material, something that's ambition was in some respects sans cultural expectation. And to have us occupy that and have the guards and the other patrons in the museum, face us down and say, and not be able to stop us from kind of bringing this different cultural resonance to this work. And the framework that gave me for thinking of minimalism as an armature for kind of cultural engagement has continued on in my project. Similar thing happens when I spent time in Marfa, Texas, walking through the work of Donald Judd. And it's funny because when you're on a tour of Judd's work, they give you the instruction not to stand on or to walk inside of the Donald Judd works. But as soon as the tour guide leaves, everyone gets on the Donald Judd work and in the Donald Judd work. So this idea that you can build an armature, right, that has no expectation for cultural resonance, has no expectation to be filled with themes, our concerns, our ideas. And when you hijack that kind of philosophy, in the case of the grid for me here, the steel grid, and then you start placing cultural context, thematic ideas, signifiers, different materials that really start to explore what it is my concerns really are, and it kind of begin to animate that space. That to me came quite from quite an honest place. It felt natural. My mother and other older friends have spoken to me in the past about the occupation of the dean's office, marching on space, different versions of activism. In some respect, the occupation of this kind of grid form resonates with me similar to those concepts of how do you get inside this thing? How do you live inside this thing? How do you animate this thing? And how do you more or less kind of, squat there as a result? And so all of those things kind of came to fruition in a work like Antoine's Organ. But I think there's some other things to discuss there as well.
Well, another thing that occurred to me the more I look at it, and is also interesting in relation to Sol Lewitt, which is always, kind of seen in the background. It's less his grids, but I've been thinking of his group of photographs called Autobiography, which is this grid of photos of his studio. And in a sense, I've been thinking of Antoine's Organ as a kind of autobiographical work. If you look at it, if you go through it, and maybe we can see some of the details, it's stacked with books that I assume have been important for your formation. It's stacked with all their very early videos of yours. And again, this plant, it might be a little bit of a banal metaphor, but you also mentioned, your reading changing since you had a child. This idea of a young man being somewhat of a young tree growing up in the city. So I wonder if, am I off when I see this also as a kind of personal autobiography or a kind of encyclopedia of Rashid Johnson?
Not at all. In all honesty, if I'm to frame this and be clear, yeah, it's an index in some respect of things that I was exploring, whether they be material and some of the suggestions there around shea butter and black soap, which you both find in the work, are some of the books that you find in the work. The Sellout by Paul Beatty, which won the Man Booker Prize a few years ago, and who's one of my favorite authors, accompanied by the Sellout by Randall Kennedy. And these books serve very different purposes. The End of Blackness by Deborah Dickerson, which really is quite interesting and kind of exploring and pushing back against themes of the Black monolith. And it's quite damaging if you are a fan of it to certain activist principles and philosophies that Dickerson sees as being antiquated, are not actually loaded with genuine radical intention. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I had read, I believe, the year that I had originally made the work, and the relationship that his kind of Afro-pessimist sensibility has to Dickerson's sense of self-responsibility, right? These really create really quite significant contradictions within the landscape of how one identifies as a Black thinker or someone who has an interest or investment in these concepts and ideas. And so I think really in W.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folks, which talks about kind of the Black dichotomy of being, double consciousness is a term that he often uses, but the Black dichotomy of a sense of Black self as a Black person and as an American person, and how those things contradict and how they create parallels and positions for concern. So, really inside of the work, there's a tremendous push and pull, one that doesn't celebrate a singular positionality around its topics, but allow for contradictions, allow for the space of humor, allow for, for an idea to kind of come into it and not unlike a diamond with light, like bounce around throughout it and give it room to kind of flesh itself out. And then, generously, if I could say that, vomit that out to its audience, in stacks and in groups, kind of composed in a way that just, delivers on how this brain kind of unfolds. The video in the slide that you're showing right now, I made as a grad student. It's called Me, Tavis, Smiley, and Shea Butter. And it's the first time I've used shea butter, and it documents or not the first time I use shea butter, but the first time I use it in an artwork, or with its idea being that it belongs in a discourse around art and artworks. But I'm putting it on my body, and I'm listening to a talk show that used to be on National Public Radio at 2 o'clock every afternoon that I would listen to, where he would, explore Black themes from different positions. And I was putting on shea butter. So it's this kind of like Afrocentric kind of theme. It's kind of humorous. It explores the idea that one can apply an Africanness to their body. And what does that mean? Does that give you any more agency in like a continental discourse? Does that actually frame or help you become more aware of your cultural identity? Does that give you more access to those kinds of conversations in those spaces? Or is there just an absurdity there? And so, there was a lot happening in here that allowed me to kind of just put things in things. And there's a book by Lawrence Weiner that I'm really interested in called Something to Put Something On. And it explores kind of the symbiotic theme of how we call things and what we call things. And one character says in this book to another character, he says, I have something for you. And the second character says, what is it? And he says, or says something like, put it on the table. And the other character says, what is a table, right? And he says, a table is something to put something on. And so in a way, this work structurally became an armature. It became something for me to put something on. And that's something that I wanted to put both on and in this work, where, all of these contradictions and all of these ideas, and then try to honestly look at it and see what came of it the more time I spent with it.
Mm-hmm. And also what I think strikes me still every time I see it, and is this, maybe it's not so apparent for others, but it makes me think of you not only as an artist, but as an artist that has always been aware of other artists. I think I don't even know if the public is so aware, but I think also you have done a lot for older artists that have been, or you've been in dialogue with many older artists that have influenced your work, and particularly also Black artists. And I don't know if it's in the inclusion of the books, but there is this sense of an individual as an artist and also as an intellectual or as a public citizen. And you mentioned the videos. In one of the videos, you are actually seen interviewing Deborah Dickerson, right? And you presented almost as though it was coming from the TV, but it's been filmed by you. And there is this idea again of your role as both a young man and if you will, a future at the time intellectual. Or I'm curious if these ideas also of education and formation and growth were all in the piece, and how you see them also in relation to the exhibition in which the work is in now.
Yeah, no, it's really quite interesting. I think in some respect it's quite Freudian. My mother's a historian, so like this investment that I have in how the canon develops and how and whom we remember and how we explore that as a theme is kind of inherent to me. And if you were to make a bad joke, you would say my mother was buried in a history book, and my ambition was probably to be seen by her, right? to find a place inside of that text that was prescient and allowed for me to garner that attention. I've always just been interested in how the sausage is made. And as far as art is concerned, that is both an exploration of the poetry of an artwork, the texture of an artwork, the process of an artwork, and the history of the artworks that informed all of those gestures, textures, and concepts. And so it's really quite cyclical. It's it's something that I feel like has always surrounded my project, and I have this real investment in how I was informed by the people who came prior to me, and of course I've had some opportunity to work with some of those folks, and in some sense it's been validating for me. It's been validating for me to locate myself amongst the artists who I lionize, to say that the things and that I make and the ideas that are of value to me, are meant to live in context with the things that those folks make. And it's an interesting thing, in particular as it functions around institutions, because there have been times, in particular in the last few years, where I've wondered to myself if I had decided to pray to the wrong God. Whether museums and canonical structures, however I wanted to bully them and push them around and restructure them, whether it was actually the place where my voice was best amplified. And I think that that's something that I'm still wondering about, in all honesty. And it has nothing to do so much with, the aspects of inclusion that many of us have been very invested in making more even. But it has to do with how our society kind of predicts, locates places, and gives agency to certain things over others. And I'm, very much aware of my relationship to that, and even my ambition to kind of push it forward in some respect. But in the back of my mind, there's still times where I think to myself, what is this thing we've built? What is this building? What are these ideas? Why do we cherish them more than the others? What value do they add if not everyone has access to them? It's challenging, but it's just because I'm challenged by it doesn't mean I'm any less intrigued.
Well, there is so much else that your answer stimulates in terms of reactions and questions. One is objects playing in Antoine's organ, but in many of your other works, a very central role. Now, the objects on the shelves and these kind of signifiers of status and of origins or myth of origins. And again, spending time with Antoine's organ, I've been thinking of it in relation to the work of artists like Cameron Rowland or even Yan Vo, artists who recently have looked at the ready-made less as a kind of antiseptic object and more as an object that actually tell us stories about its provenance and its origins and how actually that provenance is often contested. Now, you spoke about going yourself to Africa and these ideas of ownership and belonging being much more complicated than probably had seemed to you at the beginning. So I want to ask you, and that maybe has to do with your earlier work with the kind of dioramas and displays. You have said something wonderful I read about how you were interested about what happens when people step away from the radical space. And that I think also has to do what you were saying about museums. Now, you were curious about what the revolutionary or even the head of state or even the political subject does when he or she steps away from the radical space. Has any of this thought also change nowadays, in which we have seen maybe a need for radical or participatory
It's really kind of incredibly complicated for me, that idea of what is radical at this point. Whether kind of a radical gesture is to work from inside of a space and to effectively try to re-engineer that space. Whether a radical gesture continues to be protest by theme. Like, does that continue to be kind of a radical space? Like, how do you invest in radicality? How do we interpret radicality? And the relationship that has to the ready-made, which, if we're to age it, is incredibly radical gesture, right? The unmolested object, the found object, I refer to them as looked for objects more so than I refer to them as found objects. I have very little investment in finding things. I look for things, and that's why you see them live in multiplicity in my work. For instance, there's a lot of space to explore the books in this work as looked for objects, and in each of those books you see them located multiple times within the work, which I think really starts to push forward the concept that this was not just found. I didn't stumble into a bookstore and then kind of magically decide to include one copy of an author whose book I read. This is not inherently poetic. This is in the theme of kind of a conceptual and critical approach to it, which is deal with it in multiplicity, deal with it as an object, allow these materials to become mark-making tools, allow them to live in repetition, and allow their objectness and their looked-for-ness to be quite present. And I find that to be, in some ways, a radical gesture. But the idea of what is radical is really quite difficult, especially when we're, and the gross majority of us, we're educated within a quite specific Western structure that employs kind of deconstructive, philosophies to, more or less engage with any theme or idea, right? That everything is born of antecedents, right? How could we conceivably imagine Marxism to be radical, right? Like, imagine the time to which these concepts and themes and philosophies are born, right? And then we age them and reimagine them as radical tools. And you and I and the gross majority of other folks who have graduate degrees, et cetera, are educated within this Marxist structure. And I think it's taken me quite a while developing as an artist and as a person to kind of continue, because deconstruction is the only tool I have, right? I don't have a construction tool. I make this reference to my son going to school and them asking the kids, what is this artwork? And all of the kids being taught to deconstruct the artwork. They're being taught, well, this might mean this. This might mean this, right? As if there is some sort of information that lives inside of the picture that isn't necessarily present and accessible. And that's the only tool that we're kind of given to explore, the world that we live in. So I'm still trying to figure out how to best employ that tool.
It's I want to add two things and then maybe also open it up to the audience. One is that I also know how almost tortured you are by this idea of radicality, of asking how can you still be radical, or what is happening also to art and to the discourse around art that makes everything somewhat acceptable. And on the other hand, as I go to the museum and see your show every day, your piece every day, I'm reminded, speaking of Marxism, of a quote by Antonio Gramsci that I'm, quoting by memory and butchering, and that I had found on a record by Billy Bragg, so just to say how, notions of both complicity and education are very tortuous, and in which he basically says, have I been diminished as a revolutionary because I was not taught to love flowers, because my parents were not forthcoming with love, and it's it's unfortunately the only quote by Gramsci I remember, and I think about it in front of the plants every time. There is one more radical in love or in confrontation, and
this is a great question. This is really, this is, I think, the question, and it may seem like quite low-hanging fruit, but I I think tortured is a perfectly appropriate way to explain me in my relationship to this, because my background is one that was really significantly impacted by and invested in harsh and thoughtful critical theory. And I've been co-opted by and now have, an equal investment in kind of the poetry of objects and thinking about growth and thinking about the human condition and really thinking a lot about love. And that's been a hard journey for me as a person and as an artist. And I think my relationship to being a father is what helped bring me here most. It's unfortunate that we don't discuss more often the relationship that male artists have to parenting and how it evolves and changes our work. But really, once I had my son, who's 9 now, it made me ask different questions. I stopped performing from ideological position and started thinking about the practicality of explaining the world to another human being using plain language. There was no choice other than to use that plain language. And then, you come up against the obstacle of not only explaining to them how the world works in plain language, but, the challenge of telling them where and how it's going to fuck them, right? And how they're going to face significant challenges. And it's one thing to come to terms with the challenges that you're going to face yourself and to learn how to navigate space in the world. It's another thing to tell someone else that there are going to be obstacles that are beyond their control, that they're going to have to negotiate. And that blew my mind and continues to blow my mind. That need to explain, and that need to be frank, and that need to be clear and honest. And so that's kind of where the work still comes from today at this point.
So should we see if there are questions from the audience, which is always hard to envision, unfortunately, on Zoom, but one question. One question is about music, which unfortunately we didn't touch upon yet, but obviously Antoine's organ is an organ in the sense almost of a church instrument, and Antoine comes every Saturday to play, and so it's also a piece about improvisation and the structure. Actually, in a way, the basic opposition that rules the piece is the grid versus the organic, and that is also what happens with the music, the kind of improvisatory versus the scripted. And so one question is really, what is the music that is being played, and is it conceived to be a space of improvisation always, or?
It's usually in when it's being employed by Antoine has been quite improvisational. He goes in and he just plays whatever comes to him. It's usually related to jazz music, which was and is still quite inspirational to me. The avant-garde. I'm a big fan of Cecil Taylor. I'm a big fan of Thelonious Monk, and Jason Moran, who I'm hoping to come and perform in Antoine's organ at some point, and he has in the past, and he's a brilliant musician. But no, it's kind of whatever Antoine or whomever is at the helm decides to play. It's a skill set I don't have. My son has become a really good pianist, so I try to keep music around me, even though I don't have the talent to bring it to fruition.
Mm-hmm. There is one very specific question about what's the symbolism of the the kind of square object that recurs in your work, but also in the pots. There is a kind of simple ideogram almost that recurs throughout, no?
Oh, is it like the crosshairs?
Yeah.
That looks kind of like a gun sight?
Well,
It's something.
Some it's a gun sight, some is more of a rhomboid, no? Or if I remember.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a couple different. This would take us down a different path considerably, but I guess I would sum it up by saying there are quite a few signifiers and marking tools that that can take you different directions, whether it's the crosshairs, which, is for me borrowed from, again, kind of a music reference, Public Enemy, and my interest in them and their radicality is oftentimes found in the work and on some of the pots. And then the grid and our relationship to the grid. I often joke, my mother was an academic. We didn't have drawing paper in the house. And so, most of my drawing, was done on paper with lines. So I still kind of use lines as a guidepost for how to make an artwork. So when you see a lot of kind of straight lines and things that suggest the grid, I think I come by it quite honestly from how I started in art.
Mm-hmm. So let's see if there is another question. One is about the ceramic pieces, whether they are made by you, the pots, or looked for, and probably it's a combination, right, of the two.
It's a combination of the two. I'm doing more and more ceramics in my studio, and I have a great kiln now, and some folks who are helping me along the way to learn more about it. It's an incredible medium, and clay has such fantastic memory, which is interesting. What you do to it, it remembers when it's fired, which is complicated. It's a great metaphor for some of us. But I often buy things too. I buy things, I make things, whatever makes sense. So it's somewhere between the ready-made and again the handmade.
Mm-hmm. There is a question I do have to ask because it's about me and about the T-shirt. Somebody says if it's a conflict of interest that I'm wearing a T-shirt by a commercial gallery. I do want to recognize I've been wearing T-shirts of galleries from the Lower East Side since we started this series of talks, simply because they're our neighbors and they need all the support they can get. Actually, on Thursday night, the third Thursday every month, they have longer hours. And so actually, if you are downtown, go and see the galleries of the Lower East Side because they need visitors and they need viewers more than ever. And
I'll piggyback on that. Support local galleries. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, Massimiliano. I'm proud of you for doing it. I think it's important.
And would you say Nina Simone's work, life, and legacy has been a source of inspiration in your work, if any?
I would say yes. Of course, her music has had an incredible effect on me, but even more so, the significant effect and impact that she had on my grandmother. And hearing my grandmother talk about Nina Simone, sometimes you learn how to love by hearing someone else telling you about the things that they love. And my grandmother talking about her love for Nina Simone changed the way that I understood you could love a musician. And she impacted me that way, probably more than any other.
Well, maybe that's also a good place where to stop this conversation. And thank you so much, Rashid. It's great to have you as a guest, and hopefully come by again to see the show. And for anybody who is still able to come and see the exhibition, I hope you will join us soon to around the wonderful piece by Rashid Johnson, that it's really an injection of life, an incredible reflection about life in the core of Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, which was originally conceived by Okwe Edlis. So thank you so much. A pleasure to have you, and see you soon.
Thank you. Good to see you.